We'll start our intro. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. For those of you who haven't been here before, MedTech Innovator is an accelerator, a global accelerator focused on innovation all over the world. Our role is to find the most compelling startups, the ones that we're all interested in seeing come to market with innovations that improve lives and improve human health, and making sure that those technologies actually reach patients and with the maximum value possible. And MedTech Innovator, as part of our accelerator series, every year has a group of companies that are part of our accelerator. They give us their topics that they're interested in learning about. And obviously, we want to cover everything having to do with medical technology, which is our field, but we want to be very customized. So we ask them specifically what things out of all the possible topics are you interested in, and we change those topics every year. Within that, we also ask our companies to give us questions. What do you want to know about these topics? So the discussion we're going to have today is focused on the things that our companies are interested in hearing. And you, if you're here on YouTube, are going to have a chance to benefit from that. So you'll have a chance to listen to the expert discussion that's going to be coming up in a little bit. You can also submit questions using the YouTube chat feature on the side. We'll have one of our team members moderating that, and they can pass the questions along to our host for today, Frederick Nyberg, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. And then we'll try and ask your questions during our 1 hour of public broadcast. Then we're going to go to a private Q&A that's just for our cohort, where they'll have a chance to ask our panelists questions. Now, today's webinar is focused on a really important topic, which is manufacturing and supply chain. Obviously, in this past year with COVID, we've seen a huge disruption of the supply chain, and we've seen how important it is to be focused on supply chain and manufacturing. It's always been important, but especially now, especially in these times, we really need to understand, what people should be thinking about. So our whole goal in this series is to give you information that you need to be successful and to be as successful as possible. So as I mentioned, tonight's host for the webinar is going to be Frederick Nyberg, our managing director. He's going to lead our panel of experts through a discussion. And as I said, then we'll get to Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Frederick. He'll set things up and introduce our panelists. And look forward to hearing this discussion. So Frederick, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Paul. Very warm welcome, everyone. This is, I believe, our 5th webinar in our series this year. Good morning to those of you here in Asia Pacific. A very good morning to, I think we have 1 or 2 of our accelerator companies based out of Europe dialing in very early, and good evening to those of you dialing in from North America. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator. I'm based here in Singapore with my colleague Sakina. Today's topic, as Paul just said, is a very important one. Manufacturing and supply chain management, how to avoid pitfalls in outsourcing and working with contract manufacturers. We had a lot of interest in this topic as we were surveying our accelerator startups at the beginning of this program. We have a great panel this morning. We are honored to have, we have two individuals who are actually dialing in from the west coast of the US. We have Jim Warren from Jabil joining us from Las Vegas. Thank you for joining us, Jim. We'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves in just a minute. Also dialing in from the US, based in Los Angeles, is Colin Chong at Kokojo, a consulting company working with companies small and large and some of their manufacturing challenges. And based here in Singapore as well, we have Connie Tan from Jabil Singapore office. We'll have each of them introduce themselves in just a moment. So very warm welcome. I will ask each of our panelists perhaps first to just briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your company and how you typically and how your firm typically engages with startup in the medtech industry. And maybe Jim, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Frederick. And thanks, Paul. Always excited to be here. These are great sessions. I'm Jim Warren. I'm a business unit director at Jabil. Just on Monday, I celebrated my 23rd year in the company. Back when I started, we were less than 10,000 people. Now we're 260,000, roughly about 30 billion in revenue. We have a large medical device group that I work with. Just to short circuit the question, I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself or Jabil. I think you could find a lot of that on the internet. I think the big piece for us when we're starting to deal more and more with startups, the P&L responsibility that each business unit director has, we're allowed to allocate and work specifically. As it stands right now, I've got 6 mentors in the MedTech accelerator that I'm working with. And I'm finding more and more there's interest inside of Jabil with how we can partner with those folks. Everything from material sciences through additive printing, manufacturing, even to design for supply chain. So I feel that we're coming around on how early we'll start to work with startups. I'm really excited about the progress we've made. So thank you, Frederick.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Jim. And staying with Jabil, I'll hand over to Connie, and maybe you can talk a bit about Jabil's presence here in Singapore and in APAC.
Yep, sure. Yeah, thanks, Frederick. Yeah, it's my honor and it's my first time to join this webinar. I have really happy to be part of today. So Connie Tan's based in Singapore, Jabil Singapore. So basically, I have with Jabil for about 12 years. So I'm based in Singapore, and main role for me is the business unit manager, also managing some of the medical device company that require to be produced out from Jabil Singapore. So there are small to large scale customer. There are also listed customer. Yeah. So as what Jim was mentioned about Jabil's listed company, and a lot of information is available on the net, and I'm not going to go through that a lot. So I basically engage a lot of the customers in terms of the support they need, not just based on the large scale of the requirement that they require, and also some of the time that the customer requires some small scale of the business support in terms of the supply chain, in terms of the manufacturing, that they probably may not be able to done it in-house, and they look for the outsourced CM like us to support them. Yeah, but basically that is what my day-to-day is, and then the operations in terms of the business support for the customer.
Great, thank you for that, Connie. And Colin, going back to Los Angeles and the US, tell us a bit about your venture and your links to Singapore.
Okay. Yes. Hi. I'm Colin, and thanks for the invite, Frederick. And it's really an honor to be here. I am the vice president and co-founder of Kikojo Private Limited, a Singapore-based consulting company that focuses primarily on helping startups in the entire product development cycle. Now, I personally have 30 years of experience in the medtech space, 17 of which was with Medtronic Diabetes here in the United States in Los Angeles. And 5 years ago, Kikojo was engaged by, at that time, Spring Singapore. And my role was to help the local medtech startups, help them in product development and take their ideas to market. So that was how I got started up with the startup space in Singapore. I don't do that anymore, but I have two primary clients that I spend most of my time with in Singapore. One of them is a contract manufacturer, and that is Univac Private Limited, headquartered in Singapore. And the other is a startup company that has been doing really well in Singapore, and that's Endomaster. So those two companies alone keep me very occupied. But officially, I am a consultant that I help startups oversee product development and get their products to market.
Great, thanks for that, Colin. So let's dive into the questions here, and I guess for the first question really for many startups is, why would I want to outsource? What are the advantages and the disadvantages of outsourcing medical device manufacturing? And maybe Colin, will stay with you if you can give us, I'll ask you to keep the answers relatively short. We've got a lot of questions and a lot of topics we want to touch on. Colin, maybe your perspective first.
So I think outsourcing, one of the biggest benefits, I like to say it's a force multiplier. Startups tend to be very R&D centric. and they don't necessarily have the resources in terms of transferring a product from concept into manufacturing. Engaging a good contract manufacturer, you can leverage not only their skill sets, their competencies, their supply chain management, their vendor base, but if needed, you could also leverage the QMS for manufacturing. So if you have most startups would have, say, 13485, where the scope is limited to development, you can then leverage the manufacturing scope of the CM to help you from that standpoint. So I think, just to keep the point succinct, it's a force multiplier for you if you find the right contract manufacturer.
Right. Jim, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, certainly, Frederick. So I echo Colin's thoughts as well. I saw an interesting interview on YouTube last week with Elon Musk, and he was in a review of Starbase out in Texas, and he mentioned that design is easy, manufacturing is 1,000 times harder. And I think a lot of times when you're trying to go to scale, you don't understand the challenges that you're going to incur. I think the experiences that Colin, Connie, and I have, we want to be able to leverage those and be able to get that product to market at the volume that would satisfy a VC who's looking to invest. So I think that's the gain you get when you go with a contract manufacturer versus trying to do it on your own.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So one of the questions we received here from our cohort, and as Paul mentioned earlier, we did a survey amongst our accelerator companies at the beginning of this program, is how do I, as a startup, identify and access medical technology manufacturing partners in Asia Pacific? Is there any specific advice that you can give to early and mid-stage companies in terms of how to approach and how to choose a contract manufacturing partner? And Connie, you're based here. Maybe I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, so basically, I think that is requirements, all right? So what kind of scale of the product that they are looking at, and then definitely that the contract manufacturer capability and the experience that the product that they are building right now will be one of the reference points for them to look at, and what kind of product to launch to the market they are looking at, and how soon is this manufacturing is able to support them in terms of the resources, in terms of the timeline and the experiences that the contract manufacturing have been working with the others customer. It will be a very good reference for them to look at as well. Yeah.
Great. Colin, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, besides all the competencies and capabilities, in my opinion, the biggest, most important piece is to view the relationship with the contract manufacturer as a strategic partnership. In other words, there needs to be a benefit for both sides. So looking for what I think is a strategic fit is most important, because if you go to a CM that is strictly saying, look, can you build this for me? Sure, I can build it. What are your volumes? Okay, fine. It's a one-way thing, and there is no partnership. There's no skin in the game from both sides. So if you engage a contract manufacturer who, say, for example, wants to enter the space that you are in, and for them there's a strategic benefit for a direction, then it's a partnership. Both sides benefit from the relationship. And to me, that is one of the most important things to look for, versus just, in addition to everything else in terms of capability that Connie mentioned.
Right. Certainly the point about strategic fit, I guess, is critical here. Maybe Jim, how can a startup identify that area of strategic fit and ensure that it exists? And in particular, how does a smaller startup venture that may even be pre-revenue even get the attention of a company with 260,000 employees?
That's a great question, Frederick. It's kind of echoing kind of what Colin and Connie said. I think it's a combination of those things, where you obviously want to partner with somebody that can do what you're asking, and you also want to partner with somebody that is willing to work through the hard times. That's a big challenge. It's sometimes there's not a stickiness where you're going to be there through the hard times with that startup. And so you want to find someone who's committed, that really wants to be able to execute that. And I think where that starts is in the conversation, in the relationship. We want to work with people that I would say we like. We want to be able to have that relationship. And sometimes that doesn't always work out, but In the ideal environment, the opportunity is that we can build on our capabilities, our strategic activities, and then the friendships that we establish with those startups. I think a lot of times that's a soft, in the world of contract manufacturing where everything is very objective from a metric side. That's a subjective action that I think is very important. You have to like who you're working with because you're going to spend a lot of time with them. You're going to spend a lot of tough times with them. Sure, you're going to celebrate, but I promise you're going to struggle more than you celebrate. So I think finding that right person. To answer your question about how you get engaged with a large company such as Jabil, I think a lot of times what we're looking for when we work with these startups is we're looking for their commitment as well. We've had plenty of times where they come in hot. They're excited about their product and then something doesn't go well and they go, we're going to shutter and pivot and do something else. We like to suss that out early so that we can be able to commit and work with them and invest in it. And I think, again, that circles back to the importance of the relationship, the personalities in play. And so these meetings like this that we haven't done with Jabil Medical, except for the last 3 years, they're becoming bigger and bigger for us. The cohort that we bring in from Jabil started off with just 3. Now we're up to 14 people. And I think it's giving us an opportunity to engage folks and grow. And I think that gives us more opportunity to meet more folks and build those relationships.
Great points. Thanks for that, Jim. A quick reminder to our cohort participants that are in the webinar here, you can ask questions anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will tackle those questions towards the end. Or if there's some comment that you want to make during the course of this conversation, you can use the chat function. Colin, then, best practices in terms of a startup evaluating contract manufacturers and looking at their overall capabilities. What should a small company look for when they select a manufacturing partner?
So again, I'm going to just talk about what I think is the most important is put feet on the ground, visit the place. Think of it as a marriage. When you visit your potential mate's partner's home, the moment you walk in their front door, you're going to get a sense of what you're getting at. So make sure you visit the manufacturing facility. But more importantly, try to identify whether quality is within the DNA. It's quite easy to get a quality management system in place, to get a certification. It's very difficult to properly execute and have it within their DNA. So one of the things I like to do is visit the contract manufacturer, get a feel of the place, get a sense of their quality mindset. When you walk around, do they display their statistics? The company should be proud of what they have achieved. If there's nothing on the wall and they're hiding everything, that should be a red flag. One of the things I like to do is I would ask the same question of different employees and hear whether you get the same answer. Because if quality permeates the DNA, the answers will be similar. You will get a sense of the mindset. So again, I'm going after some of these soft skills. The capability and everything will be there. But to me, these are some of the things that contribute to what makes a good partnership. So
thanks. No, I think that's great advice. And obviously, not every one of the startups here in this part of the world have the privilege of working with a large contract manufacturing partner the size of Jabil. There are a number of smaller CMOs in this part of the world, in China, in Vietnam, and in India and elsewhere. Are there specific quality certifications that absolutely need to be on the list that a startup should tick off for? I mean, obviously, ISO 13485 is pretty much a given. But how about things like MDSAP? I know that, for example, a startup who wants to get into the Canadian market now, they need to have work with a contract manufacturer that is certified for MDSAP. And for those who are not aware, that's the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which is relatively new. And my impression is that there are fewer manufacturing sites in Asia Pacific that are certified to that. Jim, maybe do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So the ISO 1345 is your baseline. You want to engage with someone who has ISO 1345. Then based on your product, the requirements can change. So whether you need to have a clean room or you need to have aseptic manufacturing, those requirements will guide you down the path of who you can work with. I think inside of Jabil, one of the most important things is to remember that there's a patient at the end of every single device. Behavioral-based quality is extremely important. Inside of Jabil, we show videos of patients using the device so that the team understands how this is being used and the importance of it. I think that creates the baseline. And then from there, you have to go through. So if you're looking for MDSAP, you're right, Frederick. A lot of places in Asia are getting that audit prepared to pass through. But it isn't commonplace. If you come over to the U.S., obviously you're not going to manufacture China for China FDA, right? So it really depends on where you see your product going to market and the requirements as such. And then doing a web search to find out who actually meets those requirements will help you narrow it down. And from there, you can really dig in, similar to what Colin said, boots on the ground, getting a feel for whether quality is truly in the DNA. Do they understand at the end of every device, there's a patient? That patient could be their mother, their brother, their son, their daughter. I think that'll really guide you in the right direction when you start looking at it through that lens.
Frederick, if you don't mind, I'd like to add one other point.
Go ahead, Colin, of course.
Now, it's from the flip side, what I've learned is a lot of startups, even though they don't engage a qualified quality person to assess the contract manufacturer. They use the same folks that are there that usually are R&D centric, who don't have the right qualifications and capabilities to assess the CM. So if you don't have someone with the proper qualifications up front, then you need to outsource it to folks that have that qualifications to do the assessment, because it goes both ways, right? If you don't have the right assessor, you cannot assess properly the capabilities.
That's a great point. So what you're saying is you'd really recommend a startup who maybe doesn't have the in-house quality management competence to outsource that and help them evaluate their contract manufacturing partner.
Correct.
Great point. Great point. Connie, what are some avoidable mistakes that you come across sometimes that you may see startup make when they work with you on product development or manufacturing? So, for example, what is it perhaps that startups don't think about that may come back to hurt them later on when they work with you?
I would say that we have very minimum example that's the mistake that the startup company that actually make a mistake, because in the beginning of the stage, there is a checkpoint that we usually will work with the startup company that what are the quality requirements, what are the area that we have actually need to look at, just like the for any of the product that you wanted to transfer, the master validation plan is something that we have to agree upon and align with the any of the customers, right? So that is a certain validation, certain of the qualification need to be done and to be checked prior to transfer and prior to start out of the build product. So those are the advice and those are the checkpoints that we usually work with the customers and the startup company. So that would be a very good reference checkpoint with the new startup company or any new customer that we're actually working with to make sure that they are aligned with that on the quality perspective, aligned with the expectation from the customer, as well as the QMS requirement for both company as well.
Yep, good point. Colin, maybe let me turn to you for this question. In some cases, startups may need to work with multiple contract manufacturers. How would is that something you would advise from an early stage, or is it does it come with so many complications in terms of project management that you would really encourage startups to avoid that in the early days? And how would that dynamic typically work? Do you have a lead contract manufacturers and others become sort of subcontract manufacturers to that one partner with whom you have the strongest and most significant relationship?
Sure. So the biggest risk to that is business continuity, right? And generally speaking, startups will not have the resources to manage two contract manufacturers. So the first thing to do is to properly assess your contract manufacturer, your first contract manufacturer, and assess not just capability, but look at their financial health, their stability, right? To make sure that they're going to be around for a little while. Then when you talk about business continuity, the next piece you need to do is to assess if this contract manufacturer were to go out of business, how much notification time do you need for you to build up a stockpile and find and qualify a new contract manufacturer? And once you identify that information, get that into your supplier agreement or quality agreement so that it is in writing that your CM has to give you sufficient lead time. Could be a year, could be 2 years. You negotiate that, but you need to know that number yourself. And then from a business continuity standpoint, typically startups will then default to bringing it in-house. If the CM is going to go run out of business, it may be easier to bring it in-house because the core competencies of the product knowledge is in-house. But bringing in-house doesn't mean you can just transfer everything in. You need to have the right qualifications, certifications, whether you have the manufacturing license to do that. Make sure that when you qualify your suppliers, that they are on both AVLs, on your AVL and the contract manufacturer's AVL. So when you need to start buying parts, you don't have to duplicate that effort. It's already you're on both. And then that can be your backup plan. I personally wouldn't advise going to two contract manufacturers at the get-go as a startup, just because it's too resource incentive. You need to find that right partner that is stable. And that's why, again, if there's a strategic partnership and both have skin in the game, there's less likely chance of that happening. Yeah. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's relatively straightforward if you have a startup that just focuses, let's say, on a disposable device or on a piece of capital equipment. I think we do have a few startups in our cohort this year that have a consumable device and a piece of capital equipment, and they work together. And maybe Jim, I'll turn to you on that. So again, when you have a more complex device where you have a piece of capital equipment, maybe with PCBAs and you need a complete box build on that, and then you got something where it requires extrusion or injection molding, other than a partner like Jabil, are there even contract manufacturers that typically have that broad range of capabilities, or do the startups have little choice, but obviously have to turn to companies your size and with your set of skills and capabilities?
Well, we do have a lot of the capabilities. In some cases, we may have a capability, but we know someone else who's even better at it. And what we care about at the end of the day is quality and execution. And I think when you find the right CM, you're going to find a group of agnostic professionals that are willing to do whatever it takes to make that startup successful. When I mentor folks in the MedTech Innovator, I'm not there to sell Jabil and try and take the business and start building it. If that was an opportunity, fantastic. What I want to do is get these innovative devices into the hands of doctors and onto patients so that they can save lives. I think if you find a partner who has that direction and that mentality, then you're in the right space. If all they want to do is talk to you about what's your forecast and do you have a 2-year forecast, I get it. But one of the other, just to circle back in one point, when I talk about the team that you want to engage with to find success, if you have a quality manager on your team or you're dealing with a quality manager at a CM that doesn't drive you crazy, you probably are dealing with the wrong quality manager. Real quality management people will drive you up a wall because they're so specific. And I think that's important to remember as well. So you have to find the team that is super professional, that matches or can pull you up to a professional level as well. That's the importance of finding a partner that can address those issues and help you drive to be better.
Great points. And I particularly like the point you made earlier about the the understanding that there is a patient there at the end of the day that will be using the product or will have the product applied to them. And it's very, in fact, I don't think I've come across any contract manufacturer here in Asia Pac, in this part of the world, that look at the patient in that way. And so I think that's really important, and I think an important good takeaway for our startups here as well. Connie, intellectual property, how much of a concern should that be for a startup working with an outsourcing partner in Asia Pacific? I know there are some concerns about working with outsourcing partners in certain specific geographies that will maybe go unnamed. But what can a startup typically expect in terms of respective IP and how that gets managed?
I think in terms of the all these concerns and the respective of the IP as well as others requirements, there will be an agreement to be signed and agreed upon before the product will transfer. As a CM, we are professionals in terms of the NDA. All right, all this information is actually transferred to us will not be transferred to us without the NDA sign off. So these are the items that we actually discuss prior the entire project. I think that is also another area that we want to look at when, as what Colin has mentioned early on, when you visit the plant, when you visit the CM, then you were able to know that how is the competency and also the area of the companies is working on. Yeah.
Right. Colin, any thoughts from you on IP and whether that should be an area of concern for startups outsourcing?
One of the things that, besides everything Connie mentioned, one of the things that a startup can look for is to ask what the CM's IP policy is. Most contract manufacturers, by design, will tell you that they will not own any IP because they don't want to be your competitor. They are not in the business of designing products. So a lot of the CMs, even if they come up with the idea, the IP will be yours. So that is another layer of protection, is understanding what the CM's IP policy is. Most CMs are not there to compete with you.
That's a great point. Jim, anything you want to maybe add to that?
Sure. So, I mentioned the size of Jabil, $30 billion, 260,000 people. How do you get the word Jabil? It's just James and Bill put together. We don't want to be a product manufacturer with our name plastered on anything. That is not what we want to do. We want the OEM to shine. And to do that, as Colin mentioned, we're not there to generate and hold on to IP. We may come up with some manufacturing practices that are maybe our IP, but if it's product IP, that goes right back to the customer. We're very clear about that early on. We also understand the competitive nature, the amount of investment, the amount of time that's been spent by these startups and large OEMs to create these products. And to support that, we make sure that we firewall off any information. We don't want that to leak out. We would feel terrible if that happened. So, I certainly think the protocol and the process and the procedure of how you manage IP internally, it needs to be well documented. And when you ask for it, you should be given it without any constraints and be able to review it and ask questions about it through your legal team, referred back to our legal team. I think that'll give you the confidence. Otherwise, a lot of startups have what they believe is the unicorn idea. And they would really hurt their feelings and devastate them if that were to go to somebody else and they didn't have any control over it. Again, it goes back to partnership and the rigor and the importance of making the startup feel safe. And I think you get a lot of that by talking through the relationship, but also ask for the documentation, ask for instances of when there's been breaches. And I think from that, you'll figure out who the right person is to work with.
Thanks for that. Great point. And then maybe I'll stay with you, Jim, here. For a startup that's typically never or not yet reached out to work with a contract manufacturer, how does a typical CM charge for its services? Do the startups just place an order and they get charged by product, or how would they negotiate a contract essentially with a manufacturing partner?
Well, generally, the way it works for us is the first step is obviously the NDA. So you get that signed. That's a pretty easy first hurdle to clear. Then we want to take a look at the bill of materials and the AVL so we can do a proper quote. We want to understand what the requirements are. Is this just purely a small batch build, one-time build? Is it something that's moving into production? Is it only going to be manual production? Is there a plan for semi-automated or automated, and how is that scheduled out? Also, importantly, there when you're dealing with Jabil, we'll go through a financial analysis of the company, and a lot of startups that credit report's not going to become available. So in many cases, they're paying up front for us to do some of the smaller builds. That's to protect our shareholders. And it's also, we've been left in the lurch a few times where we dealt with somebody who we really thought was going to take care of us, and we learned our lesson, or lessons, unfortunately, as it's been. But I think the first step is doing the quote and understanding what you're getting from us. I always tell people, Jabil is not the cheapest. If you want the cheapest, there are plenty of other people you can go work with. What we pride ourselves on is execution and innovation. If it's something that you're looking to do a redesign on, where you already have an existing product and you want us to take a look at it and do a VAVE analysis, do we want to do a supply chain analysis? In a lot of cases, those are ad hoc requests that we can charge differently for. And in a lot of cases, when I'm talking to startups on the MedTech Innovator, I'll spend an hour just talking about their device and just my general thoughts around what I would change if I were to see that go into scaled manufacturing. I think if you can't have that open conversation where someone's not starting a timer and charging you, then again, maybe it's not the best partnership to kick off with.
Yeah, thanks for that. Great point. Colin, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think I wrote on here, let Jabil answer this.
Okay,
because I'm not in the business of quoting CM work.
No, of course, but you work with multiple CMOs, so you're familiar with us. No, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about different geographical considerations here, and we have startups here in our accelerator that are based in China, in Korea, in Japan, in Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, India. And of course, they have local options. They have regional options. What are your, and maybe I'll turn to Colin here because you're sort of more of an advisor. Maybe I'm hesitant to use the term more independent, but maybe I'll turn to Colin here. What are your thoughts on some different geographical locations in this part of the world? You hear very often that manufacturing costs in China has now increased so much that you have to get things manufactured in Vietnam, and there are other issues maybe with getting things manufactured in Malaysia or Singapore or India. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my view is more from understand what is your launch strategy first. Price is always important, but price should never be your primary decision maker, because you're going to pay for it in so many other ways if you go strictly by price, right? So your strategic direction to me is more important, because every country is going to have their own requirements, whether it's China for China, whether it's an import product coming into China, there are different requirements for clinical evidence. So understanding that piece to me is the most important. The second part of it is every country is going to be, I wouldn't say biased, but more comfortable with their own. So one of the mistakes I see very often is I want to enter the US market, but I'm going to find the cheapest lab that's going to do my biocompatibility out of India. I'm going to find the cheapest CRO that is based in China. Yes, they may be accredited and certified, but the moment the FDA sees that submission, their index of suspicion goes up. They're going to start digging deeper, and they're going to start asking more questions, and you end up spending more time answering those questions. Bite the bullet, spend the money with a well-known name like NAMSA in the US. When the FDA sees your biocomp was done by them, minimal questions asked. So don't always be driven by price. Don't always be driven by time zones, because as a startup, you should be willing to work in the time zone of the market that you want to enter. Use your consultants, your FDA advisors from that country, because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So price is secondary, in my opinion. Your strategic direction, your market entry strategy is the most important in selecting where you're going to manufacture first.
Thanks, Colin. I think that's great advice. We did in fact have a question from our cohort asking, do I have to manufacture in the US to enter the US market? Or can a product be shipped after local manufacturing in Korea or in Taiwan or in India? What do other startups typically do? And Jim, maybe I'll turn to you on that. Do startups have to manufacture in the US to enter the US? And if not, what should they be mindful of?
Well, to echo Colin's point, you're going to pay now or you're going to pay later, and you really have to have a strategy of what you want to do with who you engage with. From a manufacturing perspective, I haven't seen there to be a requirement. There's been a lot in the news about made in the USA and the importance of being self-sufficient. We talk a lot, but we don't do anything. We try to execute that strategy, but at the end of the day, the price becomes an issue and availability. And one of the things I'll say is, unfortunately, in some cases, we do have quality manufacturing inside of Jabil in the US. But one of the challenges I've seen is that China, the reason the price is going up is because the quality is going up. I mean, we've seen significant improvements in their manufacturing and QMS and their execution, not just at Jabil, but at other contract manufacturers, medical and otherwise, inside of China and Southeast Asia. So I think sometimes, just because it has a made in the USA stamp on it doesn't mean it's the best. I wish I could say that in all cases, but that isn't the case currently in a lot of devices where we're seeing better quality coming out of Mexico or better coming out of the Ukraine. So I really think it doesn't matter like it used to. Now, from an accounting perspective, so if you're a venture capitalist and you're investing in a company and they're putting their manufacturing in somewhere where you're not comfortable and you're worried you can't see the numbers moving around, I think that might be something you would consider early on as a startup. A lot of responsibility on GAAP accounting and such in the US, that you can track numbers and you can make sure that there isn't money being washed and some of the other nefarious things that we dream up by watching shows like Breaking Bad. But I do think it's something that VCs consider. I mean, they're making a big bet on you, and they want to make sure that they can follow their money and they can follow their progress. So in some cases, if it's a very technical and deep medical device, perhaps manufacturing it in the US makes more sense because they can go there and see the manufacturing. But in other cases, I don't think it has mattered as much now as it used to.
Great, thanks, Jim, for that excellent advice. We have about 15 minutes left here before the end of the hour, and we'll move on to the topic of supply chain management. I think at this point, and maybe I'll turn to Connie here for this first question. In more general terms, for a startup not yet quite familiar with supply chain management and some of the supply chain management considerations, what should a startup think about? What are some of the major considerations that a startup needs to start planning and thinking about when it comes to managing the supply chain for their product? And how early, typically in the design and development process, would you suggest a startup gets involved in or get started with that thinking?
Yeah, so I would say that during the design phase or either the product design phase, they have to start thinking about the supply chains, the product that they are designing in. Is that something that easily get from the market? Is it something that's a unique for the product? And is this going to go for end of life and out from the market in the next 3 to 5 years? Because this is greatly impacting their product's launch. If they're going to design something that's not availability in the market for the next 5 years, that is going to be a next phase of the discussion or the area they need to look at, and to look at the redesign of the item, and to doing the redesign the items or the change of anything of the product. It requires a lot of different additional validations and time from the startup company. This is causing them not just the resources itself, it's costing them additional costs as well. So these are the areas that they probably maybe will need to look at, start from the design phase, and it probably maybe could engage on the outsourcing contract manufacturer partner that could help them in terms of the supply chains, where they have some supply chains expertise that could give them some advice on that as well. Yeah.
Good. And Colin, maybe your thoughts on supply chain, major supply chain management considerations as well for.
Right. So one of the things that startups end up having problems with is when you're a young startup without revenue and you don't really have a name, you're going to work with whoever is going to supply you the components that you need. Very often, these suppliers may not necessarily be capable of high volume, steady state quality production. They themselves are R&D companies that are producing parts for you. So going back to the question about the advantage as a CM can bring to you is they can bring on board their supply chain that has been vetted, qualified by the CM to help you transition into that space, right? Versus using your existing supplier that may not be the most appropriate for you in production. And don't underestimate the amount of work that goes into supplier management, because based on your risk, you have to assess them. You may potentially have to perform on-site audits in addition to desktop audits. And if you end up with a large supply chain because during your R&D phase, those were the people that were willing to work for you, you're going to run into a lot of time and trouble and effort and money to get the vendors qualified. And this is where partnering with your CM early can help you very quickly consolidate that supply chain and utilize the CM's supplier quality function that has really qualified those suppliers.
That's a great point. So that essentially comes back to what you were saying earlier, that it makes sense for a startup maybe to find a single partner and in contract manufacturing, and then leverage their capabilities in terms of managing the supply chain for you. One of the questions we had here from our cohort is, how do we plan parts procurement when you are a manufacturing on-demand company? Jim, do you want to comment on that one?
Sure. Forecast accuracy is always a challenge, right? If you're on demand, there's a lot of processes you can use. The just in time, which we hear a lot about, a lot of acronyms, supplier managed inventory. They all sound great, but how do you execute them? I think this goes back to your plan. You have to really understand your market. You have to understand the available market. You have to understand the lead time of those components. You have to understand the availability of those components. Since right now lead time doesn't mean anything, it's all about whether a part's available or not. From there, you have to you can ballpark it, or you can run a statistical analysis, some Monte Carlo simulation, something like that, that'll round out. And then you have to ask yourself where you can put your money, because you can't buy all those parts and have them sit in a warehouse. You can't build up stock and hold on to it, because then you'll have shelf life issues. So what you do is you have to understand some of those long lead time parts, whether it's in ICs or if there's a very specific connector that you have to have manufactured. You have to decide where you want to tie up your money in inventory. And I think in a lot of cases, Jabil, we kind of take that for granted. I'll look at an AVL or bill of materials and I'll find 5 suppliers that I know I need to buy a lot from right away. And generally they'll be sole sourced. There won't be any options on them. So you want to make sure those are available. So it's really more about understanding your market and being able to spec out what sort of volumes you think you're going to have, high versus low. For instance, if you're kicking off in the US and then you're going to start a launch in, say, Japan or Brazil, obviously you're going to have to build up quantities and timing and such to be able to do that. How much dunnage do you need to manufacture to qualify? How much do you need to have for samples to give to people in order to get them interested in your product? You have to take all that into account. And I think that's the importance of having someone who really understands medical marketing inside the group to be able to roll up a forecast and give you an idea of exactly what you need to build up, because then you can back into it from there. You can look at how much money you have from your funding. You can determine how much you can afford in order to hold certain pieces of inventory. then it becomes very much a how do you eat an elephant sort of situation. But it isn't as complicated as perhaps I made it sound. I think that there are some very small steps you can make to understand your supply chain and understand how those partners. So as Colin mentioned, you want to have really good suppliers and you want to have ones that are financially viable. The importance of that is they will be able to support you on consigned inventory. They'll be able to support you on SMI, EDI, a lot of the things that you're going to need in order to make sure that you have on-demand manufacturing. You're not going to get that from a mom and pop one-off component manufacturer.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Jim. Great points there. Anything, Connie or Colin, you want to add to that?
I think Jim hit the nail on the head there.
I think he did. Great points. Let's just talk a few minutes about UDI, a topic that we hear more about, or heard more about over the last couple of years or so. So these are medical device unique device identification systems. What does a startup need to know about UDI and UDI systems, and how do you see it affecting supply chain management going forward? Colin, is this something you're okay to talk about?
I'm going to let Jim or Connie talk about it first from a CM standpoint. I can talk a little bit one point about a very commonly misstepped as part of the validation cycle, but I think they are more suited to answer the question.
Right. Connie?
Yeah, I probably maybe need help from Jim on this. Yeah, I have limited information to share on this. Jim. Yeah.
Frederick, can you further define the UDI for me? I want to be clear on. I think I know what we're talking about, but I want to be certain.
UDI, I think it was originally proposed by the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that these are ways of tracking and identifying unique medical devices. And there are a few different systems currently out there. I don't think we have complete harmonization yet, but it is something that is likely to affect how labeling, packaging, and so on is going to be done for all medical devices, whether they're disposable or not, going forward. And I think the US FDA has subscribed to this, and the EU has as well. And we're starting to see requirements in some parts of Asia Pacific, from Korea and Australia and so on.
Sure. So that was kind of where I thought you were going. This kind of sprung out of, you see a lot of those waste bins that you see in hospitals, and there's an entire industry that's popped up that basically reprocesses that material, whether in a proper state or not. Then you take it a step back and you go to surgical generators and even bone saws and other devices like that. The UDI concept is kind of interesting. I think of it as when you look at a piece of currency, and there's all those little things that are on the currency that help you to avoid counterfeiting. When we look at the packaging and the labeling for UDIs, whether it's 3D barcodes, whether it's holograms, there's some different pieces in there. The interesting part is you don't get all of the information that is in that barcode. You have to have a very specific scanner in order to scan that at a certain frequency in order to get the information back from it. I think, again, when we think about a patient at the end of each one of these devices, the importance of not having a counterfeit device, not having something that's been repurposed after a single use that wasn't properly sterilized. I think this gives your doctors and patients one more level of feeling of security around your device. I think it's important. It's funny is when we talk about Hermes or Louis Vuitton or Moet, Hennessy, they use these in order to make sure that their products aren't being counterfeited. And certainly if they're involved, and I think medical devices are of much more greater importance in my mind to make sure that we're getting quality devices and being able to track where they've been. I think the next thing that you're going to see is we're going to see more sensing technology in the packaging that'll be able to tell you how long it sat somewhere, not just whether it tilted or was shocked, but at what temperature it was stored, how long was it there. That's kind of the next iteration of the UDI that we see going on in the space now.
Great, thanks for that, Jim. I'm conscious of time. We have about 5 minutes left, and one of the things I did want to touch about before we close is the whole area of field service, technical service, and of capital equipment, of course, and some of the important considerations for a device startup when it comes to design and manufacturing, and again working with contract manufacturing partners. At what point in time should a startup start to consider some of these aspects? And I think, Colin, in one of your presentations a couple of years ago, I know you talked about design for serviceability. Do you want to expand on that a little bit and share some of your thoughts on this?
Right. So there, service comes in several forms, right? So I think the one you're alluding to here is more on capital equipment. Because if it's single-use sterile products or low-volume products, probably they just do a swap out. There is no worth
or
in
it's
trying
or
to
a recall it. Worst comes to worst. Yeah.
Yes, but capital equipment, this is where it becomes trickier, and you have to consider the downtime of the piece of equipment, and then you think about how do you want to service. Typically, the first level of troubleshooting would be the customer or the user themselves, right? You just like you have a troubleshooting guide, you go through a flow chart, see what's happening. The next level typically is a phone call, right? Where you have another level of service where now you can ask some questions, push these buttons. There may be some secret button sequence to push that gives more information that's not typically used. And then the third level would be your field service, where you send somebody out to do the repair. Think of your photocopy machine. Someone comes out and change the drums and things like that. And of course, the last one is where you have to do a swap, a replacement, and you send that piece of equipment back to the factory. You need to think about what your service strategy is first before you can figure out where you want to go with this. But from a design standpoint, you need to think about it upfront, because the way you design the pieces going in are the way the pieces are going to come out, right? So modular design is always good because it helps from that standpoint. It minimizes the amount of spare parts or replaceable parts that you need to store in your field office. It may cost you a little bit more to swap a module out or a sub-assembly out than to try to troubleshoot to which component is causing you a problem. So short answer is you need to think about that from the day you start your designing, right? Because writing a field service manual is not easy. It takes a lot of time because you got to think of everything that can go wrong. And there's no way you could imagine everything is going to go wrong to start off with. So you design it as modules. If the optics don't work, it's probably the optical module. I swap that whole module out and leave it as that. And that module can then come back for troubleshooting. If you try to put one PCBA there, this PCBA there, connect with these cables, and you get all these wires tangled, you just make things very difficult. So think modular, think of the cost of each sub-assembly, and think of swapping out each module if it's a piece of capital equipment.
Great, thanks for that, Colin. Any further comments on that, Jim or Connie?
No, I think Colin hit it on the head. Modular is the way to go. It makes the work a whole lot easier for anybody that's engaging with the capital equipment.
Very good.
Fully agree with that.
Time is up, unfortunately. It's as you were saying earlier, Jim. Time flies when on these webinars. So thank you so much for joining us. Before parting ways, last question, maybe one before last question. I'll ask each of our panelists is any final tips or advice that we haven't already covered that you would like to offer to to startups or scale-ups that are thinking about outsourcing either design development or manufacturing? And maybe Connie, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So the questions and the point that I think the team has sharing out is a good considerations for the new startup company to consider about before they are considering whether it's the outsourcing or to do it in-house in terms of the capability, in terms of expertise, whether they want to keep the core competence in-house and outsource the area of the manufacturing to the contract manufacturer. Those are the point that we have discussed. Is a very good point for them to consider and think about. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Colin, any final tips or advice from you?
Yeah, I do. It's a little bit abstract, but I think it's important. I think it's important for startups to recognize that you may not know what you don't know. So leverage the ecosystem of folks who have successfully brought products to market, who understand the entire system, have learned from their mistakes. And I cannot emphasize that more. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask the questions.
Great point. And these sorts of webinars is maybe a first step in that area. We'll come back to how the startups can actually reach you in just a moment. Jim, your final thoughts, tips, advice?
Sure. Whether it's dealing with a Jabil or anybody else, deal with someone who listens to you. We like to listen twice as much as we speak. We want to take in a lot of your information and think about it and come back with an answer or a suggestion. If you get someone who just talks all the time, you might not be the right partner because they don't even know your product yet and they think they already know better than you. We try to be very humble at Jabil. When we meet a startup, we talk about a product, we sense their excitement. We ask a lot of questions because we want to understand where their passion is coming from, and so that we can be a part of that.
Great, thanks for that. Final question: how can a startup reach you if they want to make contact? If you're open to share your email address, maybe you can put it in the chat to our cohort. That would be great. Connie, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I think you can reach me out from my email. Yeah, I will be willing to share my email address to the teams as well.
Okay, great. Just put that in the chat. Terrific. Colin, best way to reach you?
By email. I'm typing it right now.
All right, very good. And Jim?
Postage only. No, I'm just kidding. Email and I'll put it in there.
Very good. Very good. So thank you all. It's been a great discussion. A lot of really useful takeaways here, hopefully for not just the startups on the in our accelerator, but startups elsewhere in the region. Don't hang up yet. We will continue with 30 minutes of Q&A with our cohort in just a moment. But I will ask Sakina to disable our live stream. So thank you to all our YouTube viewers, and join us again